"Congratulations," said the nurse with that practiced smile that looked like it had been cut from paper. "You are pregnant." For a second, the words hung in the fluorescent light and did not land. My chest tightened like someone had tied a knot around it. Pregnant. Did I hear that right? I pressed my palms into my thighs until the skin went numb. If you are new here, please subscribe because I need you to hear the rest of this. The room smelled of antiseptic and lemon hand wash. My reflection on the clipboard was a pale oval, with damp hair plastered to the forehead. My voice came out small. "I do not have anyone." The nurse blinked, a mixture of pity and protocol. "This complicates things. We will notify your guardians." Those words were cold paper sliding over me. Hours later, the corridor lights flickered, and the receptionist laughed at something on a phone, and my family became a courtroom. My father, Victor, folded his arms like he could make me smaller. "Who is the father?" he demanded. I said the honest thing. "I do not know." My brother Lucas leaned forward, spitting judgment with his words. "You will end this," he said, as if he owned both the question and the answer. "No," I said. That single word felt huge and impossible, and it changed everything. They told me to leave. I packed a single bag with trembling hands, the fabric of the jeans rough between my fingers. I took the first bus to the only place that still felt like a home, my grandmother Rosa's house on the other side of town. The faint smell of coffee greeted me at the gate, and the wooden floorboard by the door creaked the same way it had when I was a child. I slept on a narrow mattress, and the blanket smelled faintly of lavender and starch. I thought then that I had nothing but a heartbeat inside me, and that might be enough. Have you ever been forced to choose between your family and your dignity? Tell me in the comments one word. A few days before the diagnosis, everything had been loud with music and light and money. I had taken a job working coat check at an event in the city center because Matteo owed rent and I could not say no to extra cash. The venue was velvet and brass, a private party for the alumni of the old university, where the powerful met and swapped favors. I had told myself it was just a shift. The room smelled of perfume and spilled whiskey, and the bass vibrated in my ribs. Oliver from the bar winked at me as I carried coats, and a man in a dark suit with a slow smile had watched me with a hunger that felt like heat. He offered me a drink and a promise of a tip if I stayed longer. The clock hands kept turning, and the wine kept flowing. I should have left when Matteo texted that his landlord was at the door, but I stayed because I needed the money and because the man with the slow smile kept appearing with another glass. Later, the lights went blue, and someone slipped something into my cup. The fuzz crept at the edges of the world. I woke up on a narrow bench with a jacket over my legs and the smell of cold metal in my nose. My phone had dried salt where I had cried. I felt violated in a way my vocabulary did not fit. I ran home with my head buzzing, and then to a clinic the next morning when the nausea would not stop. Everything after felt as if it had been recorded in another voice. That party, the coat room, the man who had smiled as if he owned the room, the way Oliver shrugged when I tried to tell him. He remembered nothing. The memory was a movie shot from too far away. I knew then I had been taken advantage of and that I had to save something of myself. When I arrived at my grandmother Rosa's house, she opened the door without questions. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and old wood. Her hands were calloused from a lifetime of kneading bread, and they trembled as she poured tea. "Rest," she said. "Eat." She tucked my hair behind my ear like she had when I was small, and my cheeks still smelled like her soap. Rosa had a thin smile that did not tell the whole truth. Her living room had lace curtains that blurred the streetlight into soft lines. The mattress they gave me had the faint imprint of a body in the cotton, and every sound at night became louder, my own breath, the refrigerator hum, the occasional distant shout from the street. Matteo called it midnight, and I lied about where I was. The small-town market run by Clara had familiar faces and a gossip that moved like a river. Rosa paid for my first ultrasound appointment by trading a loaf with Dr. Hayes, whose wife ran the clinic. The sympathy from neighbors came with folded bills and casseroles named by people I had known all my life. In those first nights, I learned to listen to the baby like it was a stranger and a song at once. The ultrasound looked like a slice of moon on the screen, and I pressed my face as close as the glass allowed to see the shadow that would become a person. I promised myself to keep the name secret until I could be sure. I will be honest about how poor I was then. The envelopes with donations sat in a drawer labeled for rent. Mateo baked bread at the bakery owned by Clara for a while, and I helped fold boxes in exchange for a few extra hours of sleep. I worked odd shifts, cleaned a small cafe when the owner Daniel could not find staff, and sold old books to the bookstore run by Sarah for coins. Every day was a lesson in arithmetic and mercy. Once I tried to sit with the idea of giving up the baby to avoid the fight and the look on my father's face, but something in my chest refused. The ultrasound had been a small universe, and I could not imagine stepping back from that. I remember nights when the world felt too loud. The baby kicked, and I reached for Grandma's hand, and she hummed an old hymn I thought had been forgotten. She had a way of making hope a steady thing. "We will get through this together," Rosa murmured, and her voice was like a blanket. I will tell you more about those first weeks because they defined how I learned to protect a life that had no name. The pregnancy came with small betrayals from my body and moments of absolute wonder. I learned to count the kicks like a secret code. I memorized the squeak of the clinic door and the smell of the antiseptic shelf where Dr. Hayes kept the ultrasound gel. I learned to hide when my father called because his voice had edges that cut me. The first time Lucas came to Rosa's house, he stood in the doorway with an expression like he could not be bothered. "You ruined everything," he said. I answered quietly, "Not everything." Rosa placed a cup of tea between us and sat down slowly. The conversation had 8 exchanges that night, each one a small jagged coin thrown into the air. Lucas accused, I explained. He scoffed, I told the truth. He threatened, I stood firm. He left, slamming a palm on the old wooden door. Rosa closed the door and hummed. The smell of rain came through the window, and the kitchen light buzzed. That confrontation left a bruise like a memory that would not go away. The pregnancy had complications that turned some nights into tests of endurance. There was a morning when I bled, and the world narrowed to asphalt and the taste of pennies. Dr. Hayes held my hand while the monitor flickered, and a nurse named Sarah wiped my brow with cool cloths. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and fear. The delivery itself was a storm that lasted long enough to teach me what strength felt like. I labored in a room that smelled of boiled sheets and the faint perfume of latex gloves. The contractions rolled in like ocean waves that knocked me hollow, and I learned to ride them by focusing on Rosa's face at the foot of the bed, her knuckles white as she squeezed my blanket. I will not spare the truth of pain. There were moments I wanted to give up. There were times when the attending nurse, Hannah, pressed a cool palm to my forehead where sweat stung my eyes and whispered, "You are doing this." The baby arrived making a small wet sound, and the room filled with a sudden, impossible smell that I later learned was newborn skin. When they placed the child on my chest, the world reconfigured itself. The weight of that presence settled into me like a name. He was tiny and fierce, and he opened his eyes as if to accuse and to claim at once. I named him Eli, because the way his fingers curled around mine felt like belonging. Raising Eli was a new kind of arithmetic. Nights blurred into days of feedings and the small calculus of how many bills we could pay. Rosa took shifts. Mateo bought extra bread and gave it to us at the end of the day. Oliver at the bar brought an envelope once and left without being seen. Clara watched Eli on afternoons when I had to work a double shift at Daniel's cafe. The community stitched itself into our small life in ways that saved us. But life did not soften the edges of need. One afternoon, Eli spiked a fever, and the cheap thermometer read a number that turned my stomach to lead. Rosa and I ran to the clinic where Dr. Hayes frowned at the chart. The prognosis was a chest infection that required hospital observation. That day, I sat in a plastic chair in the emergency ward and counted the tiles on the ceiling until my eyes blurred. I thought of giving my baby to someone who could buy him a nursery of white and soft edges. A man in a crisp suit and fine watch appeared in the lobby like he had been conjured. He had the kind of presence that stopped whispers. "Adrien Cole," he said, introducing himself with a voice that was both velvet and command. He asked calmly what our situation was, and when I said we needed help, he did not ask for proof. He handed an envelope thick with bills to Rosa and said simply, "Let me cover the hospital for now." His eyes were sharp, and when he smiled, there was a promise like a lock turning. I felt a mix of gratitude and unease. Who was this man who moved through rooms like an authority and offered rescue? A backstory is a map to understand why people move the way they do. My story is simple in shape, but heavy in texture. I grew up in a house where money was a rumor and fights were facts. Victor, my father, worked in construction and came home smelling of dust and cold coffee. He loved order and the idea of respect more than the people who needed it. Lucas, my brother, learned early that anger was a useful currency. Rosa, my grandmother, taught me the kitchen lessons that saved us the day we had nothing else. At school, I tutored younger students for a small fee and learned to
faces like books. I was 17 the first time I loved someone who did not love me back. The person left, and the gullible part of me stayed like a stain. I learned to hide my soft places. I left home at 19 because the house felt like a trap, and I could not breathe with the weight of other people's expectations. The party job was an attempt at freedom, and it became a price. When the pregnancy happened, I was terrified, but also angry at how small choices made big losses. My backstory is a string of small economies of care, the way Rosa stretching a bolt of cloth into clothes for winter. It explains why I did not go to college, and why a handful of kindnesses changes the direction of my life. Adrien's backstory explains his armor. He grew up in a neighborhood far from the glass towers his name now inhabits. He was the son of a single mother who worked double shifts and taught him that power was a way to keep the people you loved safe. At university, he learned to be exact and to keep his feelings in a locked drawer. He built a company from the edges of inheritance and the grit of long nights. Stories in the press called him a genius and an alpha because he took charge and did not apologize. He learned how to give people what they thought they wanted and to use money like a bridge or a blade. When he was young, he watched someone he loved fail, and that memory became a motive. He taught himself to be a rescuer the way other people learn a craft. He never expected a child in a hospital to change his calculations, but when he saw Eli, he found a soft place he had not accounted for. Adrien's generosity came with terms at first. He suited himself in armor of polite distance and offered help in a way that made people indebted. He was used to controlling outcomes with checks and meetings and the language of business. Loving, he feared, was messy and unquantifiable. His willingness to protect Eli opened a crack in his careful world. 3 moments in this story became tension points that felt like earthquakes. The first was the night Lucas betrayed me by bringing facts into the open and accusing me in front of neighbors. The sound of his voice was a hard stone hitting other stones. The room filled with neighbors' names and opinions like birds. My throat closed. I counted breaths and looked at Rosa's hands and felt their warmth. For several long minutes, the air felt like glass under pressure. The second moment was the day Eli came home from the hospital, and the landlord threatened eviction because a missed rent check sat in an envelope under a stack of bills. The words eviction and suit floated like knives. I called Adrien, and his voice cut through the panic with cold efficiency. He said he would handle it, and did so with a lawyer named Emerson who filed papers that same afternoon. Watching Adrien move through the bureaucracy with that perfect, tidy control made me both grateful and wary. The third moment was the first time Adrien came to our small apartment unannounced and saw Lucas standing at the doorway like a claim. Lucas reached for Eli, and Adrien's mouth formed a tight line. The tension that followed was not loud. It hummed and shifted the air. Each of those moments lasted in my memory as if time slowed and sound thin, and I had to decide how to breathe and how to answer. The encounter with Adrien grew into a complicated geometry of need and power.
He paid the hospital bills and then began to appear with small things for Eli: a wool hat, a book of lullabies, designer formula that smelled like sweet milk. He brought a nanny briefly, an offer to transfer to a pediatrician at a private clinic, a check that sat on the table like a question. I kept saying no to whatever felt like purchase and yes to the things that felt necessary. Our first real conversation lasted long, and it had 9 exchanges. He asked about the pregnancy, I told him the truth. He showed regret, I showed suspicion. He said he would help protect us, I asked why. He spoke of responsibility, I spoke of autonomy. He admitted he had been at the party and that his company had been a client organizer. He said he had seen the man whose face I described and that the man had been arrested for other things. I felt my anger flare and then cool into calculation. He asked to be allowed into our lives, and I said no at first. The more he visited, the more his voice softened around Eli, and the more Lucas watched him with a kind of possessive anger. Adrien could be gentle, and he could be a storm. He offered a contract once like a businessman offering terms. He wrote a large check and suggested we live in a better district. The question in his eyes was plain. Would I accept rescue at the cost of something like freedom? There was a scene where Lucas and I fought in the kitchen and the argument spilled into measured lines. He accused me of weakness, I called him selfish. The dialogue had 10 turns, each one a sharpened tool. At one point, Lucas shouted about reputation and the neighbors, and I shouted back about fear and cold dinners and the way he had never once stood up for me when it mattered. Rosa sat at the table between us, and her teacup steamed like a small cloud. The kettle sang, the smell of rosemary from her shelf filled the room. Finally, Lucas left, slamming the same door that had always been a barometer for our family's mood. Tempers. The house felt like a broken instrument, and the silence had its own hard edges. Adrien's presence complicated simple survival in ways I did not anticipate. He had a way of walking into a room and making decisions for me that I both lacked the resources to refuse and feared to accept. He said once, "I will make a space for you and for Eli where no one can touch you." His voice was kind and his hands were capable. I felt something like relief tethered to alarm. I loved the quiet he brought to the nights when Eli was sick, and I loved the way he sat at the small table and fed him soup like he had done it 1,000 times. At the same time, there were moments when his gaze felt like a ledger, and I flinched. There were conversations where he used the word promise, and my stomach rolled with the memory of promises broken. The tension between needing him and wanting to remain myself created a pull that sometimes left me dizzy. The resolution had to come from a place of choice. One evening, Adrien surprised me with a simple question. He asked if I would consider moving with him temporarily so Eli could have access to better care and so I could finish a course that Rosa had paid for one summer with her pension. I sat on the edge of our bed and thought of the rhythm of the bakery, where Clara smiled and where Mateo would wave each morning. I thought of the way Lucas had once been a brother and how the house had felt like a closed fist. I thought of Rosa and her thin hands and the language she used to tie two things together with a string of thought. I told Adrien I would accept help, but on my terms. I said I would not sign anything that reduced Eli to a ledger. I asked for trust and for time. He listened like a man calculating risk, and then laid down his own conditions of transparency. We made a strange agreement, like a marriage of convenience, that had to rest on truth. The ceremony that sealed our choice was not a lavish event. It was a quiet signing in a small registry office, with Rosa in a borrowed dress and Mateo clapping his hands awkwardly like someone trying to learn new steps. Dr. Hayes attended because he said he was part of our story now. The ring I wore was simple and warm. The day smelled of rain and boiled coffee and a new kind of beginning. The epilogue has 3 parts, because life keeps changing and because I want you to see the small concrete shifts that made hope possible. 1 month later, we had settled into a rhythm. Eli slept through the first part of the night, and Adrien had set up a night nurse who taught me how to measure medicine and formulate how to read the little signals that meant fever was coming. I found part-time enrollment in a community course, and the local library let me work evenings cataloging donations for a small stipend. Mateo baked the loaf that I slid into the market each morning, and Clara placed it at the front counter with a handwritten note that said, "Congratulations." Rosa took an afternoon nap every day, and her hands looked like folded paper. The city felt less foreign. I could breathe in small doses. 3 months later, we had moved to a modest apartment that Adrien had rented under my name. The nursery was painted a soft blue that Rosa had selected after vigorous debate with Adrien. There was a bookshelf with secondhand stories and a small mobile over Eli's crib that Clara had hung with a crooked smile. Lucas had shown up twice and apologized in a way that sounded like practice. He paid a small share of a bill once and left a note that read, "I am trying." Trust is a slow plant. Adrien's company had set up a scholarship in my name at the community college, and Daniel from the cafe introduced me to people who would be helpful when I wanted to restart my education. My days began to hold a pattern of study and small work and parenting and the hum of ordinary living. I learned to cook a bowl of soup that warmed like a hand. Eli laughed, and the sound filled corners of rooms that had long held only echoes. 6 months from the night the nurse told me my life had been rearranged, we had a small celebration. It was not for money or for public applause. It was a real dinner at Rosa's table with too many dishes and laughter that did not sound forced. Adrien found a way to be both alpha and tender. He supported Rosa when she demanded to be credited with the recipe, and he held Eli like someone who had decided to change his world map. Lucas came and stayed for a full afternoon and then left with his arm around Rosa's shoulders. Mateo had prepared a cake that was slightly burnt on one side and perfect on the other. Dr. Hayes toasted with small cups of tea. I looked at the room and felt the shape of what we had survived. The house smelled like burned sugar and rosemary and new pages. When I look back, I see how fragile choices can become anchors. I see how rescue can feel like a hand at first and like a steady partner later. I see how I had to choose to accept help without losing myself. The boy who was betrayed by his brother and the alpha CEO who offered protection did not become a fairy tale. We learned to negotiate power and resentment and tenderness. Our story is messy and it is true. If this touched you, please subscribe and share your single word below about what helped you get through your hardest month. Your word might be the small gift someone needs to keep going. Thank you for staying with me this far. In the end, the thing I did not know how to name became a life with a name and a small world that keeps growing.